I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. On today's episode, we are going to be discussing a new and emerging area of cyber risk and liability. This time, it's not from threat actors, but from the government. In particular, what happens when organizations with government contracts are alleged to have breached their cyber commitments in those agreements? It's a really crucial issue for defense contractors, universities, and basically everyone who sells products and services to the United States government and their service providers. To walk through these issues, I've invited two of my colleagues, Stacy Hadeka and Mike Scheimer, both as part of our government contracts and cyber team. Stacy, Mike, welcome to the podcast. Stacy, maybe we can start with you. I think a lot of the listeners of this program are well-versed in some of the cyber and privacy angles, but a little less versed in government contracts and the False Claims Act. Maybe you can first describe what is the False Claims Act and how does it relate to cybersecurity?
Yeah, well, the False Claims Act actually came about a little over 160 years ago during the Civil War. President Lincoln actually signed the False Claims Act into law to help curb fraud as a result of goods and services that were being sold as part of the war efforts. And so it's evolved over the years, but it's ultimately the government's primary tool to prevent companies or disincentivize companies to defraud the federal government and also go after those companies that ultimately do defraud the government. And so, of course, over the years, the government's been able to kind of use the False Claims Act in various industries, scenarios, especially those just involving federal funds. And of course, now in October of 2021, DOJ and the Biden administration has now focused on cybersecurity as a way to incentivize companies to harden their cyber defenses and also kind of penalize those companies that fail to do so.
So if I'm getting this right, Stacey, you're saying we have a law that was written around the time of the Civil War when obviously cybersecurity was everybody's top priority. But we have taken that statute that has been around for hundreds of years and now deployed it in connection with cyber. And you mentioned it's really designed to prevent defrauding the government. How could any entity defraud the government from a cybersecurity perspective?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And part of that has been actually captured in DOJ's new civil cyber fraud initiative. And they've kind of laid out some of the categories where they're actually focused on where companies could be defrauding the government. And part of it is under the False Claims Act, they don't want companies to submit false claims for payment. So if you're submitting a false claim, it could be also representation that could land you in trouble. But ultimately, they want to go after companies that are knowingly providing deficient cybersecurity products or services, those companies that are knowingly misrepresenting their cybersecurity practices or protocols, or also knowingly violating obligations to monitor and report cyber incidents and breaches.
I think a lot of folks in the cyberspace make a number of cybersecurity commitments, privacy commitments, data-related commitments, right? That is commonplace. To the extent that an organization were to be in breach of those commitments, there's obviously liability that can come out of that, typically in the form of a breach of contract claim, associated indemnities, kind of that typical area. But we're now talking about something bigger than a breach of contract claim. We're talking about a scenario where you make a representation about your cybersecurity program, the efficacy of your cybersecurity tools. That turns out to not be true. You're no longer just on the hook for contractual liability, but now you're engaged in quote unquote fraud.
The federal government would like to think so, yes. And of course, as we flagged initially, and you noted, there's an intersection here, of course, being a government contractor and the cybersecurity requirements. And of course, I know we'll discuss those a little later in our discussion, but the federal government is using certain requirements, regulations, certifications as kind of a tool to, I guess, reach into companies and saying that they're, falsifying or misrepresenting what they're going to actually ultimately be selling and providing to the federal government. Of course, we can discuss some of the nuances with materiality and how that standard from Escobar that we've seen come out a few years ago now, especially that Escobar has stated that it's not going after the garden variety breaches from a materiality perspective. The federal government, though, is of course looking at those as a hook. And we kind of see it ebb and flow based on the case law and other scenarios with procurement contracting that you might not even be making representation. And you're still there's an implied theory of false certification under the False Claims Act that now kind of gives them a hook that's also actually been recognized by Escobar that can kind of give you a hook to bring in some of those more garden variety contractual issues also.
So you mentioned that, this was an initiative that was brought by the Biden administration through the Department of Justice. What does that initiative look like? And are we seeing kind of real exposure in terms of fines, penalties, settlements? What are we talking about?
Yeah, the False Claims Act, of course, is unique in that it allows for treble damages. So they can calculate damages and multiply them by 3, and that really can get you a pretty high number. You also have penalties that you can face under the False Claims Act, and those range, as of 2003, they range from, I think, about $13,000 to $27,000. And a penalty can be attached to kind of each false claim that you've actually submitted. So from a government contracts perspective, it can be each invoice that you've submitted for payment that has a penalty attributed to that particular invoice. Generally, when it comes to settlements, we really only see kind of the damages aspect of it calculate into the settlement amount, and the penalties are excluded. Of course, that's through good negotiation and good lawyering with Department of Justice on reaching those settlements. But we've seen settlements since the initiative began range from the low cost of like $300,000 up to $9 million. So there's a lot of room for exposure and a lot of room for high dollar value settlements.
And I assume our limitation of liability clauses don't apply in this context.
No, not at all. And I'm sure even, the high $9 million settlement, I think the allegations in that one were in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and they can go pretty high. You just have to hope that you get the settlement value down.
So maybe, Mike, I'm interested in pulling you into the conversation. You and Stacy both are my go-to people when I'm trying to decipher and understand what the cyber regulations look like in government contracts. And what I heard Stacy just described is that there is a lot of potential liability when it comes to saying you are going to do X, Y, and Z from a cyber perspective, and it goes well beyond breach of contract. I think, as you and I both know, cybersecurity is an area of risk management, and it's very difficult to draw very bright lines about the efficacy of any particular tool. And as a result, it is not atypical for vendors and service providers to put very kind of, call it wishy-washy language in their agreements and say that this particular tool is designed to be able to, meet these particular requirements. How do you see these playing out in the contract? Is there a kind of a set of cyber regs that these organizations are held to, and if they don't meet them, that's when this liability comes in? Or are we kind of more in the Wild West of cyber contracting?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'd start sort of at the high level, which is there is a federal statute about information security. It's called FISMA, Federal Information Security Management Act, which was amended by the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, so still FISMA. But that requires all government agencies to provide security for information systems, so government information systems, like agencies, IT system, email system, whatever, but also for federal information. And it's the latter one where I think contractors sometimes get in trouble. The first bucket, and by the way, FISMA, the statute itself, is old. It's from 2002. It doesn't specify any technical requirements. It pushes that all down to the agencies. So you'll have a customer agency if you're a contractor. And that first bucket of information system security, that's kind of the traditional scenario. I'm an IT contractor. I'm a cloud service provider. I have a contract with a government agency to run an information system for them, run their email system or something like that. In that scenario, the way in which you meet cyber requirements is more well-defined. You have to go to the government customer. You have to meet certain NIST, National Institutes of Standards and Technology, controls that are mapped and selected. I think a lot of our audience will probably have heard about other NIST standards that are out there in the cybersecurity framework. Those are actually the controls and security requirements that will be in your contract. No federal information system can operate without an authorization to operate or an ATO. So the agency risk management personnel need to look at the materials that are provided in the security package, get comfortable with the contractor has represented, and then they'll issue an ATO. But notice I did say represented. So as Stacy and I have seen that, yes, the False Claims Act has been used before in scenarios where it's sort of an IT contract, the representations made to the government in all the security documentation perhaps were not accurate, or there's a fraud claim under that. False Claims Act can come into play there because you've induced essentially the authorizing authority to give you the ATO and say, we're going to operate this system at an acceptable level of risk for my agency. Again, agency specific. But if there's a fraud claim there and whatever was presented to the government, that's a False Claims Act angle. That's the traditional stuff. The newer thing we're seeing is that other bucket, which is federal information. The security protections must follow federal information. So you get a whole host of other contractors who are not IT contractors, who don't run an information system on behalf of the government, who would see FISMA and NIST language in a contract and say, why is this here? I'm not doing IT work for you. But if you're going to have access to or receive or generate, because the government paid for it, government information, FISMA actually still applies to you because it's federal information. And the area where we're seeing a lot of focus is on controlled unclassified information, or CUI, which is sort of this middle zone between classified information, where Stacy and I work on fairly often. That's things classified at secret or top secret, requires a security clearance. Those rules have been very tight ever since World War II. That's kind of its own world. But one tier down is what we call controlled unclassified information, or it used to be called SBU, sensitive but unclassified information. Contractors could often have access to that, or have an email from the government with a CUI marked document, or create something. If it's on the contractor system, now we're in this other world. You will have to make certain representations, and this is relatively more recent, about the last 5, 6, 7 years here, where contracts have required, you may receive or generate CUI. I, the government customer, need some representations from you. The current standard is a publication called NIST 800-171, which is about controlled and classified information in contractor environments. There's 110 security controls. Meeting those controls is supposed to be how you demonstrate reasonable security for CUI on your system. The Department of Defense has kind of led the way on this. They have a standard contract clause that talks about you must meet at a minimum 800-171, which does mean certain customers can impose more requirements. I think the Navy is notorious for adding additional requirements, but as Stacy and I know, that's probably because a couple of years ago in the news, there rose level of Congress, there was a breach of someone in the nuclear submarine contracting community, and CUI got in the hands of some bad actors. So the Navy's kind of under extra scrutiny. But again, it's an agency-specific thing. So DoD has their rules. We don't yet have, unfortunately, though Stacy and I have been saying every year, it's coming any day now, a government-wide rule with a standard contract clause on CUI for all government agencies. It doesn't exist yet. So you will have some differences between a different agency. Every agency has a CUI program. Everyone's supposed to safeguard CUI. But what the Department of Energy might do versus HHS versus DoD might be a little different, though 800-171 is supposed to be the standard.
Yeah, so DoD actually implemented new regulations and clauses that require contractors now to actually do a self-assessment or ultimately get assessed by DoD, which, of course, if you're getting assessed by DoD, that might help you feel a little better about your attestations and what you're actually implementing. But of course, if the documents that are, I guess, informing that are incorrect or knowingly prepared to be wrong and say that you're doing better than you are, you have concerns there. But every government contractor working with DoD is receiving CUI, as Mike noted, actually has to submit a self-attestation and self-assessment score into a database that now DoD has to indicate what level of compliance that they have with respect to implementing those 110 NIST 800-171 controls. And so you're making a representation to the federal government that you have implemented a certain number of controls, you're meeting certain cybersecurity standards. And if that's knowingly falsified, right, you're acting with reckless disregard, which is not a negligence standard, but it's like a negligence plus. So, if you have your head in the ground like an ostrich and are just letting folks go off and fill in numbers, and maybe you're not, intentionally doing it, but again, not really implementing compliance policies and procedures to ensure they're accurate, that could be a problem.
So that's even outside of the agreement, Stacy, in the attestation process, where you have presumably an officer of the company making representations or affirming certain statements to be correct. And the fact that they affirm and they turn out later not to be correct is a basis for then bringing a False Claims Act action.
Yeah, and I've seen in some instances now that the government agencies, and primarily with DoD, where they're actually asking a high-level official or principal at the company to actually sign a letter also saying that they comply with the requirements as part of their proposal submission on a contract. And so, of course, agencies, and Mike can talk to it a little more too, in addition to kind of the regulations we're talking about, the agencies have been kind of ad hoc incorporating cybersecurity requirements into contracts, and it's letters getting as part of your proposal. That's actually not required by regulation. So we're seeing agencies get creative in how they're requiring companies to attest to their compliance with all these requirements.
Yeah, and I'd like to note, State, too, that I think the driver we've seen on a lot of this is, again, this category of information, CUI. More than a decade ago, 2009, 2010, there was an executive order under President Obama that said, we're going to stop calling things sensitive but unclassified, get all the agencies in the government together and sort of bang heads together to go, you need to identify a statute, a regulation, or a government policy that justifies why a certain category of information should be considered CUI. The intention was to be helpful, and I supported some of this back in the Pentagon back then. I remember the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, is the executive agent for this, and there were hundreds of categories of information across the government, and the idea was to shorten that list. And I think the current CUI registry, somewhere between 80 or 90 categories of information, which is still better than it was a decade ago. But it does have to refer back to, here's the statute or regulation or government policy that says why this is not, say, classified, secret or top secret, but also not appropriate for public release. There's this justification for why it must be protected. And that's what drives all this. But the CUI regulation the National Archives put out dates back to, I think, Stacy, like 2016 now. And they said, you must safeguard CUI. We've all agreed the government's going to be called this thing. But as we said, only DoD has like a standard contract clause on how to do it. They were leading the charge on that. We're waiting for one sort of government-wide, but until that happens, every agency is actually supposed to, under the CUI regulation and FISMA, the statute I mentioned before, protect government information. Well, in the absence of sort of a standard bit of contract language we're all going to use, they're all kind of doing it a little differently. And that's what's driving behind that. And on the attestation point, as Stacy and I remember, even for DoD, it used to be sort of a self-certification. The contract clause said, essentially, by virtue of this clause in your DoD contract, you represent you're meeting adequate security, which is 800-171, or if the customer has something conditional. And that was it. And they didn't ask. And that just hasn't worked. So we've seen in the last few years, that's kind of where this is growing is no, you need to actually attest to it. You need to put a score in, the stuff Stacy mentioned. That is new. And I think that's why we're seeing this become a bigger issue. If you went back a number of years ago, it would have been the government was kind of, we're just going to trust but not verify that you're doing it. And now you have to attest you're doing it.
Exactly. And those attestations don't just apply to the prime contractor, they actually flow down to the suppliers too. So I think where we're going to see a lot of impact with the government kind of initiatives with the cyber enforcement is you're not immune if you're just a subcontractor working for a prime contractor because you're not in privity of contract with the government. No, if you're a subcontractor working on a federal contract, and then you caused that prime contractor to submit like a false certification on your behalf, you can also still get in trouble. So suppliers actually have to put their scores in that DoD system. So if that's wrong, that could also lead to liability to your suppliers and impact that prime contractor's relationship with the federal government. I do want to note too, just one more attestation requirement too, relating to software attestations. The federal government's going to be rolling out government-wide a software attestation requirement, and that's going to be offered by third-party providers, software sellers ultimately. And that's kind of another hook that the government can use if they misrepresent how the software was built and attest that it was built a certain way or by certain engineers. That could open the door to False Claims Act liability too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Mike, I'm interested in one other point that you were making, especially around the CUI rules or the absence of those rules. And that results in perhaps bespoke sets of contractual language that differs by agency. As you and I know, and we've discussed in the past, is that cybersecurity has been a difficult area to regulate, including that the technology oftentimes outpaces kind of whatever the words are on the page. And that is also then combined with what the threat actors are doing. And so trying to define what an organization needs to do is difficult to be very precise. And so in many ways, we've seen that play out in the privacy world, where states have standards of saying you need to have reasonable and appropriate security, or the GDPR says appropriate security to the risk, right? And so you have these very broad standards, which in some ways makes sense because it gives the flexibility to be able to figure out what's right for your ecosystem. On the other hand, it leads to great possibilities of second guessing, because what seems reasonable at the particular time may not seem reasonable later. And importantly, it also drives to a position where saying, well, you had a data breach. As a result, we know you didn't have reasonable security, because if you had reasonable security, you wouldn't have had a data breach, which, as you know, is basically a strict liability standard, right? How does that work out in this context? Does that mean that organizations, if they have a breach, that somehow they could be alleged to then have a False Claims Act liability just because they had a breach?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Stacy and I have worked on that in the DoD space a lot. So we should say that the DoD in their contract regulations, the DFARS, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, has an incident reporting provision that's separate from the NIST 800-171 standard we mentioned. So in order to say have a DoD contract and represent that you have adequate security, you have to meet the 800-171 requirements, which have incident response or IR controls in there themselves. But it doesn't specify what to do specifically with this customer. So that's the additional DoD piece of language is you must rapidly report any cyber incident within 72 hours. There's a place to do it. But that's not in 800-171. So DoD contractor has to meet the 110 requirements and then also be clear, I contractually with DoD must have a process to report incidents. We've been through a number of these reportable incidents. There's the DIB, Defense Industrial Base Reporting Portal, because that's the critical infrastructure sector that defense industry rests in. But we've seen sort of a wide variety of how the government responds to that. Like they will probably want to know if you report an incident, what your controls were under your system security plan or SSP for 800-171. But it's not actually by default. It doesn't mean that DoD says you clearly must not be meeting 800-171. If you're a DoD contractor, you're probably subject to state actors, advanced persistent threat. You are a target. And there is no perfect cybersecurity posture, but even the best gold standard you have means you could still be penetrated by an attacker and they could still get data. And I think DoD is sophisticated enough to recognize that. And in the cyber incidents that Stacy and I have worked on, that's been part of the conversation with DoD. So the incident reporting actually goes to the DC3 cybercrime network guys who are down in Quantico, where like NCIS is and the Air Force Security Service. So there's security and counterintelligence guys. Like they want to know about the attack so they can see if it's happening to others and stop the bad guys. They're not really going to be the ones to say, it looks like security wasn't adequate. That would be a whole separate discussion with the customer whose data was affected and whether or not they knew that you weren't meeting something, or maybe you were meeting all the requirements and the customer was comfortable with it, and yet you still were attacked. So I would not go out and say that sort of, when you've reported an incident to DoD under the rules, that has turned into DoD every time saying you clearly didn't have adequate security under the 800-171 standard.
Yeah, and I'll note too, I think one area of defense for companies that we'll probably see because of the NIST standards, there's questions about some of those safeguarding controls being up for discussion. Maybe there isn't one way to meet a certain requirement. You can also have plans of action and milestones. So you might not actually meet all those 110 controls, but the government's still going to accept that you don't meet some, but have kind of a plan in place to eventually meet it. And so even if you haven't implemented all of them, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be properly meeting all the requirements and thus subject to False Claims Act liability. So
yeah, and on that point, Stacy, we've seen, of course, before, like if the customer knows that my POAM or plan of action milestone says we are on target to replace this hardware or this app or whatever it's going to be, so we can do something under one of these controls, then the customer knows about it. So sort of the likelihood of there being a fraud claim under like the False Claims Act is much more diminished there. The customer knew about it, but that isn't always the case.
Yeah. And maybe another kind of component, as I understand the way these False Claims Acts can present, is it's actually unique compared to a traditional breach of contract claim where you would have to prove that there has been a representation or warranty or covenant that's been breached and resulted in damages. Here, there are additional ways that a False Claims Act type of liability comes up. Stacy, what are we seeing in terms of the various ways that people are bringing these claims?
Yeah, so for the most part, what we've seen is kind of the two categories that Mike kind of highlighted. One, if you're selling a product that's supposed to meet certain cyber standards and your product does not meet those certain standards. So one of the earlier settlements that we saw back in 2019 was with Cisco, and that was for 8.6 million. And that was the result because they had security cameras that didn't actually meet the security requirements that were required in their government contracts and state and local contracts. So they ended up settling with both the state of New York and the federal government for providing surveillance cameras that didn't meet the requirements. We've also seen a recent case too this year, also providing services where they found a vulnerability and disclosed it. And there were concerns that because there was a vulnerability that they said wasn't going to be there based on the requirements in their contract, that led to an investigation and allegations of False Claims Act violations and an ultimate a $4 million settlement with that particular company. And then there's kind of the other areas where we've seen the misrepresentations. And there was a huge settlement back in 2022 with Aerojet Rocketdyne that was about a $9 million settlement where they actually represented to both DoD and NASA that they were compliant with the cybersecurity regulations and clauses that were in their contracts. And so through their misrepresentations, it was actually their chief information officer who worked for Aerojet Rocketdyne for several years was the whistleblower in that particular case. And so he had said, well, I was trying to get them to understand that they can't actually make this fulsome representation, and they did anyway. And so there was a risk that they were going to be found liable.
And Stacy, on the Aerojet Rocketdyne, I think, correct me if I misremember, that was one of the second bucket ones where this is about CUI, this is about a sensitive government category of information that you have access to, contractor, or it's on your system. As opposed to like the earlier bucket where we're like, I'm actually the IT contractor, I represent that my stuff meets these requirements, you get an ATO. We're now seeing the second bucket, which is I handled this category of information, CUI, or had access to it, and there's a claim that you fraudulently represented, you had safeguards in place to handle that stuff.
Yeah, and I think the third bucket, which of course was highlighted in DOJ's Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative, is that kind of data breach cyber incident reporting obligation. We just haven't seen one yet. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe there's a whistleblower case or DOJ case under seal right now that maybe is alleging something with respect to that, but we've seen it more in those kind of first two categories.
So one question I think that we will often get from clients is, tell me about the enforcement risk, right? What does that landscape look like? And I think what you're both describing is that it's actually quite rich in terms of where the government is taking these particular actions. But importantly, for False Claims Act liability, the action doesn't only need to be brought by the government, right? There are options where individuals, right? You're talking about whistleblowers. How are the other ways that these types of actions can be brought, even if the government is not involved?
Yeah. So sometimes you'll have a company report it to the government and that triggers an investigation. And then very commonly we see through qui tam lawsuits or whistleblower lawsuits that a lot of times it's an internal employee who will bring the allegations and file a complaint alleging False Claims Act liability, or they can reach out to an inspector general within an agency or coordinate with DOJ too, and kind of whistleblowing that way. But a lot of times there's a pretty strong plaintiff's bar representing whistleblowers. And so they'll go out and find individuals within the company, represent them, and file a lawsuit alleging False Claims Act violations. And that, I think it's been since the 80s that the False Claims Act was kind of strengthened to allow individuals to come forward and report allegations of fraud. And there's a whole whistleblower protection program. So if they do that, companies can't fire them. And then, of course, more importantly, on the whistleblower front, they get some monetary reward if a company is found liable and violating the False Claims Act. And so they get a chunk of that settlement. And so it incentivizes a lot of people to think about ways on how they can go after either their companies. And a lot of time, the employees are disgruntled employees that become whistleblowers. They've raised the alarms internally and it falls on deaf ears. And then they decide they're going to actually take actions. And again, with whistleblowers too, now with the DOJ Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative, we'll certainly be seeing that there's more incentive for companies to kind of raise the alarms internally if they think the company they're working for isn't complying.
So that's quite a unique regime, right? Because if you would say, going just back to contractual relationships, if I have a contract with Mike and I breach my obligations to Mike, it doesn't allow Stacy to sue me, right? And so now you're talking about a scenario where an individual is almost kind of bringing a claim on behalf of the government and is incentivized to do so because if it's successful, I heard you say that there is some sort of monetary reward or percentage that they're able to claim. Is that right?
Correct. So they get a chunk of the actual settlement amount. And so it incentivizes them to go after one, allege as much damages as possible. And then once the damages get settled, so even if a company settles with DOJ, doesn't admit to liability, so isn't actually found liable yet, they still get a chunk of that settlement value as part of that. And it is a unique regime. I think because we've seen some recent Supreme Court decisions out, that regime is actually getting challenged now as unconstitutional. The Supreme Court kind of hinted that maybe the whole whistleblower program under the False Claims Act is actually unconstitutional. I think there's a case out of Texas where one company, a medical device company, actually is challenging the constitutionality of the whistleblower program. So we'll see where that goes. That might go up to the Supreme Court. They may rule on that and find that the uniqueness of that capability is no longer within the bounds of the law. But as of now, the plaintiff's bar is ripe and well, and we're starting to see a lot more activity in the cyber front.
I mean, and Mike, interested in your thoughts maybe on that question too, but with an additional wrinkle in that in the cyberspace, right, there's no company that's out there that has no cybersecurity risk, right? When cybersecurity is a matter of managing risk, mitigating risk, it's not a matter of putting risk to zero. And risk, by its very nature, is something that requires an evaluation, and it will also result in inevitable disagreement, right? In other words, people's natural tendencies, some are more risk averse, some are more risk tolerant, and that plays out in just the way that we experience life in our personal lives and our professional lives. And that's also going to show up in the way that cybersecurity programs are set up. How are you thinking about companies facing potential qui tam lawsuits because one person within their organization disagrees with the company's position on what risk is appropriate and what is not?
Yeah, that's one of, I think, the functions of the regime that we have now, we didn't have years ago when it comes to government requirements. So again, that first bucket under FISMA that we talked about, you do have the government making the call. They're the ones ultimately have the risk management authority under statute to say, I agree that Gmail or Office 365 or whatever the system might be can run on my agency systems. I issue an authorization to operate. And that, I think, the fraud claims might be a little clearer because as Stacy and I talked, earlier about if you misrepresented the government and all the security package paperwork, what you're actually doing, and the government may not have issued the ATO. They've decided they will operate the system at the level of risk they're comfortable with as an agency. If you gave them something inaccurate, you induced them to do it, that I think is maybe the cleaner one. The stuff we're seeing now, though, with it's my system as a company, and I have to, for the CUI requirements, meet the 800-171 controls. NIST has done a great job. I have all the respect for Dr. Ron Ross there, who's behind this particular publication. But yeah, as Stacy said earlier, there's not one answer for every control. There may be different ways to meet these. They don't require a particular technical solution. There may be disagreement about all these things. And that's just a function of how the things were intended to be worded. But now that we've got this attestation layer, the government's kind of tied this sort of in a little backwards knot here. It's, before companies were able to say they met the 800-171 requirements, and it was kind of a best practices approach. We're not describing a certain thing you have to do under a given control. But now you're attesting that, yes, I meet all of these. So who decides that I've actually met 110 versus 90 versus 80? And that's the challenge Stacy and I are seeing is, does everyone agree, right, that we've met this 100%? Or we're 65% there, and what we have to do goes on the POAM, Plan of Action Milestones. We're still working towards completion. There's not a clear answer on that. It's not really a model of clarity. Reasonable minds can disagree about, is this control completed or not? But the cover on some of those things is what we talked about as well. Maybe it's better now if your government customer wants to see this. Before, it would have been, I don't want them to maybe know what's going on in my systems. But now you're kind of getting back to that ATO world. Well, my customer was well aware that we only have 80 controls 100% implemented, and they were okay that the rest were being worked on or on the POAM. That's helpful. And that's kind of where we're seeing right now. But yeah, again, there's the controls themselves. There's not necessarily a straight answer for all of those. I mean, one I've seen that's an interesting one is removable media and CUI. And the answer for some companies might be, well, we just ban removable media. And I go, okay, but how do you enforce that? How, not to go to the classified world, but as you might have seen with both Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, they use removable media to take classified information off of a classified system. So just saying we're not going to allow flash drives in the computer lab isn't necessarily enough. So we've got a wide variety of ways that companies might try to respond to a given control, but reasonable minds can differ on, did I fully meet it?
Sounds to me like, Mike, if what is key and what is most important is transparency, accuracy, perhaps, in the responses, because it sounds like, the agencies appreciate that having any type of cyber control is not going to mean you're never going to have a cyber incident, but they need to be the ones to be able to make their risk tolerance determinations based on accurate information. And where these False Claims Act issues comes in is when they're potentially being misrepresented and thus not able to make an accurate risk calculation.
Yeah, and that goes back to the sort of traditional FISMA ATO world. The idea of a system security plan has been around for a long time. That's one of the security artifacts you give the agency authorized authority in that world. You have to have a system security plan for 800-171 as well. I think for a lot of more commercial companies who didn't have to do the other FISMA requirements in the past decade or so, that was a new idea. It was, well, I may have a security policy on a topic under 800-171, like the audit and accountability controls or IR, instant response. But no, I don't have a system security plan for the system that the government wants to know about. That's the first step right there. And it is actually a control in there. That was a thing that I think in earlier development was uncertain with industry is how do you want us to answer this? It is a control. To meet the control, you must have a system security plan. It may be better now if the government wants to see those, because that's also your cover is we documented it in a system security plan. Here's how we meet the control. If the given customer has a problem with that, you can work that out with them. What's not ideal, I think, is if there's not transparency with the government and an issue comes to light later and the system security plan is weak or says it meets a control where it's pretty reasonable to deduce it actually doesn't. That's the problem. So I wouldn't encourage companies to like throw things to the government they don't have to look at. But I think Stacy and I have seen it is helpful cover when your government customer actually reviews these things. Or as Stacy mentioned for DoD, the higher level assessments under this requirement are actually done by the Department of Defense. So if you can get yourself to actually have DoD do the assessment, it's a lot stronger than we did a self-assessment as a company. Here's our score, but DoD may disagree on if you meet all those or not. So it's been actually helpful. We've seen folks do the level 2 and level 3 assessments. DoD does those for you. When you're invited to do those, I think that's been useful.
So with that, maybe my last question before we wrap up is, let's kind of pretend for a moment that you're not lawyers at Hogan Lovells. Instead, maybe put your in-house counsel hats on. So we're going to pretend that you're in-house counsel. Stacy, I know you were once in-house counsel, so this may not be that difficult for you. But let's just say that you're in charge of managing your government contract cyber risks for your respective organizations, which are significant. And your CEO walks into your office and says, "Hey, I listened to this podcast by this law firm, and they scared me about all of the various things that are going to happen about False Claims Act liability, and I certainly don't want to be wearing an orange jumpsuit. Tell me, what is the couple of things in your mind that you would recommend your business take to be able to try to reduce this risk?" Stacy, I'll ask you to go first, and then maybe Mike, you after that.
Yeah, and I'm sure Mike and I will have quite a bit of overlap on our recommendations. But if it were me, one, of course, policies and procedures, that if you're an in-house lawyer, you kind of live by documenting and ensuring that everybody in the organization knows and understands the requirements they have. Another area, because government contracting is really unique, and as we talked about, there's various clauses and regulations that are related to cybersecurity. You have to start with the contract. Like, you need to look at your contract and know what the contract says. Are you providing an information technology product that needs to meet certain standards? Are you getting access to the information? Are you going to be required to report cyber incidents? So knowing your contracts and looking at them and assessing them is a really good place to start. And then lastly, and I think Mike will have more comments on this, think about a third-party auditing company, like having an audit, because as you noted, you might have disagreements and you may have somebody thinking that they know it all and believe they're right. Having that third party come in is a really great way to kind of get comfort of what you're doing and having that documented. And maybe you do that under privilege also, so that it helps you when you realize you have certain requirements you're not meeting and need to implement and actually address.
Yeah, I agree with all of those. And the first one, as Stacy said, back to basics, know your contracts. I would start there. We touched on that earlier, that there's this overarching statute, FISMA, that drives a lot of this, but companies should really understand what they're signing up to. And actually, frankly, while this is definitely an important topic, Stacy and I have also negotiated out federal contract terms that are just throwing the whole kitchen sink at a company. That's the first step. So not even know your commitments. I'd say even before you sign a contract, be very clear what requirements under FISMA, what NIST standards. We haven't even talked about things like the Federal Privacy Act. What things do you actually have to comply with? Because some of these contracts are kind of generated by the contracting officer team. They're not the security team. So they don't necessarily really know what some of these requirements are. But if I am just sort of in the CUI receive information world, and I'm only ever going to get it if the government emails me something with a marked document, I should have to comply with these other areas. So to add on what Stacy said, I'd say be very mindful before you even sign the contract and try to negotiate some of these things out. Keep the government honest, right? If we're supposed to be safeguarding sensitive types of government information, we need to be really clear on what those are. And then the second piece that's related to that is, again, because I focus highly on the CUI piece, because as Stacy knows, I was back there in the Pentagon when we were working on the CUI program. So to see it kind of be muddied between the contracting folks and industry, it just like breaks my heart, because we thought a decade ago this was going to be a model of clarity and solve everyone's problems, and it's still kind of messy. On that one, I'd say be very clear with your government customer what sensitive data you would receive or generate or have access to. That's still an open thing that's kind of outside just the cybersecurity controls. You'll have government personnel that will say everything, including our email conversation, is CUI. That's too broad. That's not accurate. And you can only protect this information if you know where it is, right, and what it looks like. So I think that's a fundamental piece too. Just get your arms around the CUI that you're going to receive or generate, or where it's going to go, or where it's not going to go. Like if it stays in a certain environment, my system security plan will only address that environment.
All great points. And I think any company would be very blessed to have you both. Thank you so much, Stacy and Mike, for joining me. But before we wrap up, one thing I definitely wanted to make sure that the audience knew, Mike, is of your podcast, because some of the issues that you're talking about today are things that you cover on your podcast, which is focused on national security. Just want to give a quick summary to our audience for those who are in the national security space.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Thank you for that reference. Yes, we have the Hogan Lovells National Security Podcast with my colleague, Tim Bergreen, who was a staffer on the House Permanent Select Committee for Intelligence. So he can bring the intelligence community angle. I have the defense background. We have a lot of great guests on. So yeah, appreciate the reference there, and I encourage the audience to check out the National Security Podcast too.
All right, so that means everyone should be adding not only the Data Chronicles to your queue, but the National Security Podcast. We'll keep you up to date both on data, national security, and all things between. My name is Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those are your data points.